I'm up for a few questions if anyone has them. If I can't answer them, if there's anything about David I don't know, but if anyone has anything they want to ask, I will try.
And also we have a lit scene coming here, so we're going to use the microphone for everybody.
I answered all questions.
Thanks for reading. I'm reading the corrections for the first time now, and somebody was talking to me about the relationship between, perhaps complex relationship between Jonathan Franzen and David Foster Wallace. I was wondering if you could shed any light on that.
You know, I mean, I write about it a lot in the book, the way that most people see the friendship now, a lot of people are very angry at John Franzen for comments he made after David's death, and an essay he wrote, a complicated essay, but a piece of which suggested, basically that David's suicide was a kind of career move. I mean, you have to read the rest of the essay, but anyway, I think that David basically feared other writers, and he also feared competitions, especially from male writers. And John Franzen, through a very odd combination of mixture of their personalities, was able to sort of get through this kind of defense that Wallace had put up. And I think one reason is that they really were, David in a letter to Franzen describes them as best of friends and lit combatants. And I think if you think about it, David had been very active on a very successful high school tennis player. A lot of what David said is made up. But David really was a great tennis player. I mean, he wasn't world class, but he was good enough to be a ranked Midwestern high school tennis player, which is pretty good. And I think that he drew that the paradigm for David in male friendship was basically an athletic team, a sports team. And so, in a funny way, when you look at it, even with John, it's continuing now after David's death, it has a lot to be in common with sort of, young men in the locker room sort of snapping towels at each other's butts. And that was the way that they communicated. And later in life, I think David really did care deeply for Jonathan. I think he was the one friend, the one writer, kind of more or less on par with David. I mean, at least who's trying to do the big thing the way David's doing it. That he would allow into his presence and even crave. And there's some really interesting correspondence I found, where at one point, like, people don't know this about John Franzen, but David writes some letter to John talking about a bunch of sort of literary theorists whom he disdains, and he's throwing out, Saussure and Derrida. He's doing this thing that he does, just laying it on real thick. And to my amazement and surprise, Franzen calls him on it and writes back with what looks to me like, I mean, I'm not great at these guys, even though it's a compliment major, a deeper knowledge of literary criticism and literary theory than Wallace had, and you can just see Wallace's jaw drop, because he's never been fucked with in this way before. I mean, he says, if you haven't read Derrida, you're not a writer, and MFA students just wilt. And there's Franzen tough enough, with his own rat tail of a towel ready to snap it back at Wallace's ass. And I think at that moment there's a kind of bonding. I mean, it's a strange friendship. And I've often sort of asked, where did John get this idea of this friendship? Because I can see where David did it. And more I think that a lot of what, I don't know if any of you know the writer Christina Stead, who wrote an absolutely wonderful novel called The Man Who Loved Children, ironic title. But after I finished this book, I always loved the title Every Love Story is a Ghost Story. And where it came from, as far as I knew, is that David, at various times in his life, in these letters that people would give me, would sort of jot it at the bottom of a note. And he would often give it to Virginia Woolf in an odd little postmodern feint. He'd be like, every love story is a ghost story. Virginia Woolf on the Merv Griffin show. A decade later, it'd be in a diary or notebook of his, where he'd say, every love story is a ghost story. Virginia Woolf on the Johnny Carson show. Very few things interested David for that long. He had this big brain that would kind of chew things up and spit it out. And yet this thing stuck in his head. Anyway, recently, a fellow who runs the Howling Phantods website, which is the terrific Wallace website, everything you want on David is there, went as a favor for me to the Australian National Library, because it turns out that Christina Stead had used this phrase in a letter that she writes in 1974, and the implication of the letter is one, I think she just lost, it's not her husband, but it's her companion, right? And she's saying really that every love story is a ghost story. In other words, that their marriage, or their relationship ended in death, and she feels as if, it's an obvious enough idea that when you're with someone for your whole life, the survivor is left with a ghost. But it turns out that she actually wrote a short story with that name, and I don't think the story exists. There's a list, the fellow from the Howling Fantod site found the list in the archive at the Australian National Library, which contains a list of suggested stories for a volume I don't think she ever published, and one of them is Every Love Story is a Ghost Story. So, it doesn't really answer why David cared about it. It only answers why Christina Stead cared about it. One thing I was going to say is I feel in some ways that John, in the corrections, but also maybe to some extent in his life, is really thinking a lot about Christina Stead and her stance in the culture of the time and her way of writing about people. It was just sort of an interesting sidelight. When I read the corrections now, I feel very much the presence of the man who loved children. So if anyone writes a biography of John Franzen, they can